You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a new podcast series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives are conversations that take an objective, data-driven look at a range of timely topics that matter most to business executives. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series, and we're back for part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Uwe Schulte, the leader of our Global Sustainability Center at the Conference Board and an expert in all things sustainability. When we first spoke, we covered various aspects of sustainability, including the state of the world, plastics, and so forth. And we just touched on the climate change issues. So we wanted to go deeper now in this second part of the series and really focus on climate change. What are the causes? What can governments, businesses, and individuals do to combat it? Uwe, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So, Uwe, there's been so much debate as to whether there is or there isn't climate change, and then whether there is or isn't global warming caused by man. Can you just talk about the science behind all of this first?
Yeah, may I just explain what I believe is the scientific method? Because people are getting sometimes confused about that. Scientists don't have an absolute truth. They have current knowledge, and it's based on observations. And on these observations, they work on these observations and build a hypothesis. And that hypothesis then creates predictions, and these are checked through measurements. And if the new findings are in line with the hypothesis, this can form a theory. And if we do this, then that's fine. But at any point in time, that theory can be proven wrong by new experiments. So no absolute truth.
Yeah, and this is really important, Uwe, because there's so many people running around saying all of this is settled science, but what you just said says there cannot be settled science because science is ever evolving with new facts and data, right?
That's absolutely correct. Any scientist who would say, I have the absolute truth, wouldn't be a scientist. On the other hand, of course, if we wouldn't base what we do on science, then we would be lost. We wouldn't have mobile phones, we wouldn't have cars, whatever. Yeah. So we use science all the time, physics, chemistry, and it's good for us. All the better healthcare that we have today compared to people in the Middle Ages, that's all based on science, of course. Now, coming back to your question, in 1988, the UN formed this famous intergovernmental panel on climate change. That's quite some time ago. By now, 195 governments are members of this panel. And what people sometimes misunderstand, that panel doesn't do any research on their own. What they do is they look at all the published science from one review to the next, and they summarize it. And they summarize it so that politicians who have to make the decisions have the best knowledge of what the current view of science is. And one thing I think that's important, 30 years ago, in 1990, these guys said, we are certain, that panel said, we are certain emissions resulting from human activities are substantially increasing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. These will enhance and warming the Earth's surface. And they predicted this would result in a likely increase in global mean temperature of about 1 degree centigrade above the present value by 2025 and 3 degrees by the end of the next century. When they said it, they were still in the 20th century. So that were their predictions 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that, really over, throughout the industrial age, the temperatures have risen about 1 degree Celsius, correct?
Yeah. We are now roughly 1 degree above the temperature compared to the pre-industrial age. Yeah.
Right. And so how significant is 1 degree? I mean, it doesn't sound like anything.
Yeah, I always find this amazing because people say, what's 1 degree? This is nice. Yeah, I have a warmer summer or anything. That's the average all over the world. And that is very, very significant. So the differences between ice ages and warm times that we had were only a few degrees centigrade as well on the average temperature.
Wait a minute. So the difference between the warm climates that we're experiencing and an ice age is just a few degrees? So 1 degree
average.
Then, so 1 degree is a big deal.
It is a big deal. It is really a big deal. And as you know, we're already experiencing that now. Yeah, because what they also predicted was that extreme weather events would occur more often. And that's exactly what we're now seeing.
Yeah. So Uwe, you don't know this, but in April of 1970, I marched in the very first Earth Day protesting pollution and emissions, but it was all around the science at that time. We were just into a 30-year cooling period, and all the studies showed at that point in time that we were going to go into an ice age. And so I was marching because I was a little younger then, but I said, I don't want to live in an igloo the rest of my life. And yet now here we are on the flip side of it. So this climate change, the climates change and it's variable, but the point is that we need to focus on what we can't control, right?
Yes. Now, the first thing I think, Steve, a lot of people confuse weather with climate. Yeah, and we should be very clear about that. Right. Climate is something that changes basically over centuries and not over days. Yeah? And weather is something. The best weather forecasts are now 3 days, basically. Yeah? So. Now, that's a bit exaggerated, but in essence, that's what we're seeing. So weather is something that's local, that is short-term, and climate is a long-term change. And what we will experience in this climate change with global warming, we will experience areas that have been warm that will cool very significantly, because certain things that have influenced the weather over a long period of time suddenly don't exist anymore because, for example, the temperature difference between the Antarctic and the equator is changing, and therefore the winds are changing and stuff like that. So weather will be colder and warmer. There will be more rain and less rain depending where you are, but it will be more extreme. That I think people should understand.
There are so many variables in this, it's very complex. And despite the advances of science, I don't think we have completely modeled this. But there are a lot of fluctuations caused by natural occurrences. And you've talked about this, the sun cycles, radiation that comes from space, and the wobbling of the Earth, all of these things that are far out of our control. But then there's the effect of humans on the globe and pollution and emissions and all of that. Can you just talk about the relative effect of natural occurrences versus human-caused global change?
In 2007, there was a really good study, and they looked at the different effects. And they came up with an estimate of saying that 0.2 degrees centigrade, sorry, not using Fahrenheit here, Steve, were caused by things that aren't influenced by human beings. The reason is that different effects, and let me try to explain that very briefly. Different effects have different influence on the average temperature. So to take, for example, volcanoes. Yeah? Volcanoes emit CO2, but they also emit ash. Now, the CO2 gives participation in global warming, whilst the ash is actually cooling us down. So you have to then look at what the overall effect is. And actually, volcanoes have only generated about 1% of CO2 that we humans have generated over the last decade or so. So it's very clear that actually the ash from volcanoes has a slightly decreasing effect on global temperatures. Also, the last 50 years, if you look at the sun activity, the sun, of course, influences what's happening, but it would have a slight cooling effect if we wouldn't have done anything. So what I would say, most of the naturally occurring things have actually not had a major effect, but 0.2 degrees is also significant, as we've spoken before.
So point two out of 1. So you're saying, let me make sure I have this right. So you're saying that only about 20% of the long-term effect, because you said weather is variable and fluctuates, of the 20% is natural, which means 80% is driven by human beings. Is that how we should think about this?
It's a bit of a simplification, but yes, we could say that they have erred on the side of the bigger number, and over the long run, we are actually still increasing. Yeah, so the percentages are changing.
Yeah. Okay. So so there's these sunspot cycles that everybody talks about, and I understand that on average it's 11 years. It fluctuates between 9 and 14 years, but that period is relatively small. So that's a short-term period. So
exactly.
A sunspot cycle gets hotter, it gets colder within that cycle. But what you're talking about is over hundreds of years and the average, which is the important thing to focus on, right?
Yeah. So I think what we can clearly say, yes, we haven't understood everything, but they've done a lot of experiments. For example, people have said cosmic radiation might actually cause global warming on Earth because they might cause effects in the atmosphere. There have been tests done, and the tests have shown that this isn't the case. So people are looking at all these hypotheses. They're trying to understand all the effects. And I think we have now a fairly good understanding. And by the way, when we say greenhouse gas, that's not only CO2. That's also methane, for example, and other gases. Ozone is one as well. And by the way, ozone has 2 effects, depending where it is in the atmosphere. So complex. You are absolutely right, Steve. And nobody can say that they really understand everything. But what is now clear is that human production of greenhouse gas is the major effect on global warming as we're experiencing it at the moment.
So for all these naysayers, and look, you and I have both challenged, we've been debating this among ourselves. So forget about naysayers. For people who say, I don't believe, for whatever reason, I don't believe that humans cause that much. The fact is that human beings cause some, right? I mean, so if it's not 80%, if it's not the majority, everybody has to agree that there's some. So then you can't control what happens to the sun or to space. So isn't the argument, why don't we just focus on what we can control? Why don't we focus on not polluting? Why don't we focus on not emitting? And let's control what we can, and let's not fight about how much here and there. Is that a legitimate way to think about it?
I think that takes at least sort of the edge of the argumentation. It is important that we say we can influence it, we have an effect, and let's do what we can. Because what we really don't want is an increase in these extreme weather events. We don't want this for human beings because there's loss of human life involved, but we also don't want it for business because that makes business much more difficult.
Now, so you talked about greenhouse gases, and everybody talks about CO2. And there were chlorofluorocarbons, if I could say it, that we talked about a lot in the 70s, get rid of aerosols and all of that. Yeah. But, I've been reading that the majority of global warming is caused actually by water vapor.
Yeah.
And so you say, well, that's not something we can control. But then then there's the water vapor that actually is released because of what mankind does. Can you just talk through that whole subject?
Yeah. It's absolutely right. Water vapor is the major cause of global warming, but we had always clouds in the air, of course. Yeah, so that hasn't changed that much. But if air temperature rises, you can imagine more water vapor can be absorbed. No, absorbed is the wrong word. Scientists should forgive me.
Held.
So the atmosphere can carry more water vapor in percentage terms. And that means that actually this is a self-enhancing effect. So if we cause with other effects that the temperature rises, more water gets into the atmosphere, and that will enhance the temperature even further. So that is something that is unfortunate, but we have these self-enhancing effects. Permafrost is another example. Yeah? We rise the temperature, and then permafrost gets not frost anymore, and that releases greenhouse gas. Yeah, so that's what some people call about cliff edge effects that we have to watch out, which are irreversible.
We're talking with Dr. Uwe Schulte about climate change, and we've talked about some of the various causes, both human and natural. And next, we'll take a deeper dive into what we can do about it and explore the pros and cons of different forms of energy production. We'll take a short break and be right back with my conversation with Dr. Uwe Schulte.
Interested in this content? You can find this and much more at our Conference Board website, www.conference-board.org. Or, even better, contact our membership team and your company can enjoy the benefits of our in-depth research around the economy, environmental, social, and governance issues, public policy, marketing and communications, and human capital. As a member of the Conference Board, you will be able to have full access to all of our cutting-edge research, leading indicators, benchmarking, and data services, in addition to webcasts and podcasts such as the one you are enjoying now.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by the leader of the Conference Board's Global Sustainability Center, Dr. Uwe Schulte. Uwe, there are all these things going on. We said, okay, we can't really control the sun. Nobody's figured out how to do that yet. So let's control what we can control. So who should be the controllers in this? What is the role of governments, businesses, and individuals?
Now let's start with the governments, and they have to play an important role here. And we have the Paris Agreement, and the vast majority of all governments have signed up for it. And unfortunately, the commitments that have been made so far are not sufficient to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, which we really want. So governments must revamp their plans. But there is also an important element, Steve, that we cannot emphasize enough. We have to have a just transition. So the burden of these new targets have to be distributed in the population the governments are responsible for in a way that people can actually live with that and support it. Otherwise, we will have issues like, that certain people get out of jobs. We have to find ways of transitioning them into new jobs. We will have rising energy costs. We have to make sure that people can cope with that. So governments have those two elements to look for.
This is a place where people really start debating, and you get into the Paris Climate Accords and all of that. And basically, what you're saying is that the wealthier countries need to do more because the poorer countries can't afford it. But then people look to China and they say, well, most of the emissions are coming from China. They're building a coal-fired plant a month. They don't really care. They signed on, but they're not really doing anything. And so all we're doing is destroying the economies of the developed world in order to fund China. So, and so you get into all these political arguments in this. How should we be, in the West at least, be thinking about all of that?
Yeah, I'm not really a politician, and we're just seeing a change in the balance of power around the world, and that has to be carefully been watched. What we've seen in China is an understanding that they need to do something. And I traveled China, and I've never seen more windmills than in China. So, but I agree with you. And by the way, when you talk about China, India is also a very important partner in this, because they're building actually still coal-fired plants that are more polluting than the new ones in China. Not that I want to see any coal-fired plants in the near future anymore if we can avoid it. So I have the problem that by pointing at somebody else, it's easy to say, then I shouldn't be doing anything. We have to play our part. and we have to increase the global pressure on everybody else to play their part. That's the only way forward, as I see it. No country on its own can achieve what we have to do.
Yeah, and so therefore, you come back to, and again, we don't. The purpose of this is not to get into the politics, but for those people who say, well, forget about it, we shouldn't destroy the economies of the West, to subsidize China. Maybe the best way to think about it is, look, we all need to get together. We all need to work together. We all kind of need to hold hands on this thing and try to coerce each other gently to all improve on this, because we have one globe that we live on and we spin through the same air. So, to me, you sort of say, okay, when you take the emotion out of it, it leads you back to the same place.
Yeah. And, don't forget, China's main industry line is on the coastline. And what we're currently doing with the temperature rising, we're raising the sea levels. So there will be effects on them which they want to fight as well. So I'm absolutely confident that we will see that people will address these issues. And by the way, to say I have a business disadvantage if I do these things, I will also have a business disadvantage if I have more extreme weather events. So there is no way out of this.
So there is a cost. So what should businesses and individuals be doing?
Yeah.
Give us some ideas.
On businesses, I think what you have to do, wherever you are as a business leader, you have to look at the impact that you are causing, and that is your total value chain. It can't be just your own operations, and it will be. I think what people will discover, the amazing thing is when you look at the total value chain, you actually see optimization potential still. Yeah, when you look from that perspective, and what you have to do is to say, I want to lower that impact. I don't have to go to zero. Even so, we see a lot of companies now committing to net zero. That's a debate on its own, Steve, that what that means. But as long as you have an understanding what your impact is on greenhouse gas generation, you can actually then develop a plan that combines business opportunities and prepare for threats as well.
Yeah, but even as individuals, okay, so you say, well, any individual doesn't matter, but collectively it does. And individuals, you control the heat in your home, you control how much you drive, and those are all emissions, right? So, and those of us who are extroverts and talk too much, we could just talk a little less, and that would cut down on the water vapor too, I suppose.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, you have to breathe. So it's just sort of the percentage in a certain time interval is changing. But overall, I think your impact will be the same. But on the individual, Steve, I think what is important is, I don't like this. You have to suffer. You have to consume less. You should. That's not the story that is important. There are so many things you can do without actually changing the quality of your life. Just being conscious about things that are possible. Now, of course, there are also things that aren't that big of a hurdle, and you can do that. And you are absolutely right. Heating and cooling is the biggest thing. And investing in insulation of your home, if you can do that, is something that actually pays off. It actually pays off. Now, the payoff period, depending where you are, might be quite long, but it does pay off. And on mobility, you will not be surprised to know that I have now decided to have a full electric car. And I have to apologize that it's not a Tesla, Steve. Yeah, sorry. But I'm actually saving money on this thing. It's amazing.
Oh, that's just because of all the government tax credits that you get over there.
Absolutely. I knew you would say that, and I gave you that goal. But on the running cost, so I think we're still on a learning curve on this one. So eventually, this will be cheaper. And that's something I think people should actually seriously consider e-mobility now. It will not change their lifestyle significantly, but it can do a lot of good. So individuals, yes, you should be conscious about your contribution.
But it also depends on the source of the power. So, I had a plug-in hybrid as well. And so I was running mostly on electricity. My wife had a diesel. So everybody says, oh, she's got, you were doing much better than her. But in fact, her diesel was, it was a clean diesel with diesel exhaust fluid. And so her tailpipe emissions her impact was less than mine, because mine was fired, my electricity was produced by coal-fired plants. So there is this whole thing about what powers the grid. So let's talk.
Yes.
So what should we be doing there? Where is that going? Because people seem to be dialing back on nuclear, which is emission-free, and dialing up the use of natural gas, which is better than coal, but still a fossil fuel. And then you've got fusion and these other things. Can you just talk through the science of that?
Yeah, that's, of course, a very complex area. Now, the first thing I have to, unfortunately, tell you that fusion is something very interesting. It's become more realistic than it ever was. That's for sure. But before 2050, we will have no industrial type solutions there, if we ever have it. So fusion is something worth pursuing, very important, but not something that will address the 2030 and 2050 issues. Then nuclear. I think it's a similar issue here. A couple of things. One is to build a nuclear power plant takes a very long time. If you look at the proposals for the projects that have been made, for example, in the UK or in the US, they have taken 3 or 4 times the original plan for many, many reasons. Some are bureaucratic, others are engineering reasons. So I fear that even if nuclear would solve all the other problems that nuclear has, and I'll tell you in a minute, it will not come in time. So we have, unfortunately, to look at transition technology like gas. We have to look at transition technologies like bio-based fuels. And I think hydrogen will play a very important role in all of this. Now, hydrogen isn't as efficient as going with electricity directly, because you need to first generate the electricity and then convert it into hydrogen. But still, for the steel industry, for other industries, this will be a very important route to reduce carbon emissions.
Yeah, and you've been outspoken on renewables and the importance of wind and solar, which is true. Except, the technology. I think, look, if I was running the R&D of the world, I would focus basic technology on shrinking solar panels to make them more efficient and smaller, and then also increasing battery storage, because you've got the fluctuations in production with renewables. So you need something to even it out, which is battery storage. But that'll get there over time, I assume. So what are we thinking about here? A 50-year period?
Yeah, storage will come more quickly than we thought. It's interesting. Okay. I have been approached by a couple of people who have new ideas around storage, which I cannot share at this point in time. But I believe that, first of all, the battery technology has an enormous boost at the moment. You might have heard that very recently, one of the major lithium-ion battery producers has now produced a sodium-based battery, which would be cheaper and easier to recycle. So I think we will see a huge technology jump, and I believe there is a lot of business opportunity in these fields that people should just embrace. So storage, you're absolutely right. Storage is the way to go.
This would make a great subject for part 3 of our series, Uwe, to talk about the whole energy and so forth. Isn't it interesting that we're now moving to sodium? One of the very first, as you know, one of the very first currencies ever used by mankind was salt, because of the importance of salt to the human system. And here we go. It's like a one giant circle that comes back. Uwe, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on the climate crisis and possible actions to mitigate it.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every few weeks, I'll be joined by a leader from our centers and business executives to provide insights on the issues of our time. We'll cover the leading topics in public policy, environmental, social, and governance, marketing, communications, the economy, the human capital, and more. Please join us. Share your CEO perspectives with your colleagues. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.